Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Khalid. But without further ado, let's look at what we are going to discuss during the course of the show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, with the media briefing by the DGISPR, in which he highlighted the May 9 incident and what are the major decisions that have been taken by the army and the major actions that have been taken by the forces as a result of that. And he talked in detail about the 9th of May incident. He talked in detail about other issues as well. But we are going to highlight this media briefing of the DGISPR as part of our first segment, whether it be the self-accountability of the army, whether it be the 9th May events that the army considers to be extremely disappointing and says that it is a black chapter in Pakistan's history and a conspiracy against Pakistan. This is going to be our first story. Our second story of the day concerns Wagner's revolt in Russia. Now that he has backed off, what led to him entering Russian territory and claiming the claims that he did make? What is the background of all of this? Is this a threat to the current Russian Federation government? Is it a threat to Putin? This and more will be discussed as part of our second segment. Then we are going to look at Pakistan's economic outlook, the government attempts to stabilize economy, the relationship with the IMF, and of course the different positive incentives that are coming on from the left and right that could indicate that the deal with the IMF isn't far away. This and the PSX that has surged by 1,200 points adds to the stability as far as Pakistan's economic outlook is concerned. This is going to be our third story. Our final story concerns incident in a mosque in Pulwama and how the Indian Army entered that mosque in Pulwama and then asked the people to chant Jai Shri Ram over there. We remember Pulwama from 2019, but this is a new chapter as far as the not only human brutality. Should I call them human brutality? Should I call them the Hindutva policy or more? This is the way India and its forces are moving along as far as the Muslims, as far as the Christians, as far as the Dalits, as far as the Sikhs are concerned. This is going to be our final story. Let's begin with our first segment, and that concerns the media brief by the DGISPR. We've been joined by Syed Muhammad Ali, a senior analyst, to tackle different aspects of the media briefing by the DGISPR. Thank you very much, Syed Muhammad Ali, to have joined us. It's a pleasure to talk to you about issues that are pertinent to our country and our security. The DGISPR, Major General Ahmed Sharif Chaudhry, today highlighted different facets of the 9th of May. How important, in your point of view? Let's look first of all at his 9th of May perspective and what he highlighted as far as different actions have been taken, and of course his media brief. How important is this media brief today, in this day in history, and the way the DGISPR and has highlighted different issues and perspectives around the 9th of May?
I think, not sure, Omar, I think the ISPR's perspective reflects three things. It reflected Pakistan Army's shock, anger, and grief. I think as an institution, because what happened on the unfortunate day of May 9, which is considered a black day in our history, is unprecedented in our history. And that was encapsulated by DGISPR when he said that what happened on May 9 is not something which even our biggest external enemy can dream of achieving. But it was done by a mob which attacked the symbols of our pride, symbols of our sacrifice and our honor. So that is something which is not just a physical harm. And it is very important, Omar, to share with your viewers why Army takes this so seriously. Because its honor, its symbol, its sacrifices, its dignity has been targeted. It's not just the physical harm or the loss of blood or sweat, which takes pride in sacrificing for our nation, for our country. But that is why I think the most important aspect was said that the high command, the leadership of Pakistan Army is being asked by the widows, by the orphans of our shuhada, by our martyrs, that why did we sacrifice our loved ones for our country? If these people are going to desecrate the symbols of our sacrifice, which we hold so close to our heart and dignified like nothing else, that these are the ultimate symbols of our honor and dignity. So I think it is not just a matter of national security. It is also a matter of the honor and dignity of those which Pakistani armed forces considered as their greatest heroes. Protecting their honor and dignity is also as much their responsibility as guarding the frontiers, the territory, and national interests of the country. I think he captured that very aptly.
He captured the essence of that sacrifice and how we need to respect and honor that sacrifice of all those who have lost their lives for the defense of our motherland and continue to do so, even in this current day and age. I think that was a very important message that was laid down by the DGISP. You said there were three aspects. Now, you've talked about the first. What are the other two?
I think the second aspect is that, as it is said, there was a method to madness. It was not just an unexpected, unruly mob based on their raw emotions that went on a spree to attack some buildings. That was not the case. But he unambiguously mentioned that there was a very extensive multi-domain plan, a strategy which had an international prong, which had a domestic prong, which had a kinetic prong. It was planned, it was coordinated, it was facilitated, it was incited, and it was implemented. So it was not an accident or a unplanned incident. That was the second thing. And army has identified and taken to task among its own ranks those individuals who either were supportive or negligent in their responsibilities towards ensuring the security of these installations. And nobody, irrespective of his relations or rank or seniority, has been spared or will be spared if they find evidence of their negligence or involvement in these heinous crimes. That is the second very important message. And the third very important message was the purpose was not just to physically harm or destroy or disrupt or burn these buildings or these symbols, but to sow mutiny and incite chaos within the rank and file of Pakistan Army, and to reduce the motivation and morale of our rank and file and reduce their trust and confidence in their leadership. Now, this is extremely dangerous for any military institution around the world. And the third aspect was equally grave in the international context. That was aimed at creating a fake narrative internationally by vloggers who spew venom against Pakistan and Pakistan state institution on a daily basis in order to create alarm and build a case for international pressure on Pakistan through the international community by presenting Pakistan as an unstable nuclear power, which deserves international concern, coercion, and pressure at a time when our country is facing challenges of acute political and economic nature. So these three things prove that this was a very well-planned hybrid warfare being waged not just within our streets, but through social media and around the world, aimed at destabilizing Pakistan, isolating Pakistan, and weakening the social contract between the state institutions and the nation.
All right. Ali, I'd also like to understand something that the DGISP has said, and he talked about the process of self-accountability. He said this is being done within the army without any discrimination. How important do you feel is this statement as well? Because we know that there are very high-ranked officials that have been court-martialed. There are others, there are also family members that are being talked about. How do you see this process of self-accountability as an example, as a message to all those who might try or who are trying to, as you yourself pointed out, create a mutiny, chaos, having strategy to destabilize Pakistan internationally, nationally, with a proper mechanism, and also to put a bad name to our armed forces and to our establishment and all the sacrifices that have been made in this regard?
That is very important. And I think Pakistan armed forces have proven themselves and stand on very high moral ground when they have timely and adequately identified individuals within their own rank and file, and after thorough, extensive investigations, taken them to task, even to the level of a 3-star general, and some major generals and 7 brigadiers are being, investigated for that. And I think they will face the consequences of either their negligence or complicity. So that means the message is very clear for our judicial system and also for our political, that like Pakistan now, they should also, in the greater national interest, not listen to any international pressure or fake narrative or be sympathetic on the basis of some political complacency, but in the greater national security interest, must identify these black sheeps within their own rank and file and report them and take them to task. Because, we are civilians, we are political leaders, we are political parties, we are army. All of us have a common interest, have a common cause to build Pakistan as a secure, stable, and prosperous country. So if anybody who abates, facilitates, or hides anybody who's harming Pakistan's national security interest must not only be identified, must be taken to task, and must be punished, and must be seen to be punished, to ensure that nobody in the future can even imagine doing such heinous acts in future.
He has said that the facilitators of this tragic incident will also be dealt with severely. How important is it to lay down the benchmark of the future of Pakistan so that no force, no party, no organization or no individual can even dare try, talk or act against Pakistan's interests? Ali, Syed Muhammad Ali is online with us. We are having a little bit of technical issue. We're getting back to him, but I was asking Ali about the media brief made by the DGISP. It was a very detailed briefing that he gave. He talked about the 9th of May incident. He said that it was very sad, condemnable, and the darkest chapter in the 76-year history of Pakistan. He also talked about, as I asked Ali, he said the process of self-accountability within the army is done without any discrimination. The DGISP said 2 comprehensive institutional inquiries were conducted into the incidents of violence at various garrisons on the 9th of May. He also said that these inquiries were presented over by officers of the rank of Major General. He talked about the disciplinary action that has been taken against the officers concerned who failed to maintain the security and the sanctity of the garrisons and the Jinnah House. He said there is no distinction of rank or social status in the accountability process of the army. The bigger the post, the DGISP has said, the bigger the responsibility. He also said the investigations have revealed that the May 9 tragedy was being planned for several months. Syed Muhammad Ali, now that you're back, I was just talking about the statement of the DGISPR that talked about the investigations that have revealed that the May 9 tragedy was a result of a planning that went on for several months. How important is also to take the planners of this conspiracy to book, and how important is it to lay down an example so that nobody can dare lay a finger or try to do any act against Pakistan's interests in the future?
I think it's very important, Omar, because not only because, for law, it is very important that it needs to be transparent. It needs to have a psychological deterrent effect. The success of law is not in punishing the people, but in ensuring that most of the people who are law-abiding, who are peaceful, responsible citizens, respect the law, and they realize and recognize that those few individuals who take law into their own hands at the cost of our national security interest are adequately and timely and comprehensively taken to task, so that they also trust the social contract, Umar, is essentially based on a nation's trust in its state institutions, ability and will to protect their interests. And that is why law and the legal system is the most important pillar of national security, because the nation any nation and all nations need to respect and trust its state institutions to protect their interests. And that is why this hybrid warfare, which was waged by this mob, essentially aimed at this core, this center of gravity of our social contract, to erode, to weaken, and to fragment the social contract by converting and replacing the honor and respect of armed forces with hatred through fake propaganda and fake narrative. That is why it is very important for our nation to understand, and also for our international community to respect and recognize that what Pakistan is doing is in its national security interest. It is a compulsion. You remember, Omar, what happened to those people who attacked the White House and the US Capitol Hill? They were given 18-year-long punishment. So I'm sure those congressmen and women who expect to be a friend of Pakistan must recognize and realize that, like the US law, like the US national institutions, like the US symbols of power, Pakistani nation and state also expects its institutions, its judiciary, to take to task those individuals, those misguided people who are anti-state, who promote the agenda and interests of our enemies and take law into their own hand. They must be, the law must run its course. It must, they will also be given the right of self-defense. They will have access to justice. And I must also ensure and emphasize that Army Act and Official Secret Act are part of the larger constitutional and legal system of Pakistan. It is not something which is beyond or besides our constitutional or legal system. It is very much part of our constitutional and legal system. It is only because the nature of crime specifically deals with national security interests. That is why people and institutions who are specialized in investigating and evaluating the nature and form of crime must undertake this legal process, unlike the civilian court. However, these criminals will be given the right of self-defense even in the army court, and if they will also have a right of appeal in the superior civilian court as well. So it's a due process as per international legal commitments of Pakistani state, as per Pakistan's constitution, as per our laws, in the greater national security interest. And anybody who raises any aspersions towards this process is trying to help protect those individuals who are responsible for planning, abetting, coordinating, or encouraging violence against the state interests.
That I totally agree with you, Ali, and also what you said reminded me of one of the quotes of what the DGISP said. He said, the basis of stability of any country and nation is the relationship of trust and respect between the people, the government, and the army. Syed Muhammad Ali, thank you so very much to have joined us, to have talked to us on this briefing of the DGISPR on the May 9 incidents, the actions that have been taken by the army, and of course different other points that the DGISPR also highlighted, including the Indian atrocities in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Let's come to our second segment, and that concerns the recent developments as far as Russia is concerned. Mutinous Russian mercenary fighters from the Wagner group making their way to the capital before they were ordered to to step back as per a certain deal that was made between the government and them. What is the backdrop of all of this? Where is this moving along? Who is behind these mercenaries entering the Russian space? More in the following report.
The world watched an unprecedented turn of events in Russia as an armed mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group challenged top Russian military brass. Feudal Wagner Group owner is seen as the biggest threat Russian President Vladimir Putin has faced to his 22-year rule. Wagner mercenary boss had demanded that top Russian military brass officials be handed over to him so that he could restore justice. The Kremlin said the question of personnel changes was a sole prerogative of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Mutinous Russian mercenary fighters from the Wagner Group were making their way to the capital before their leader ordered their return to base to avoid bloodshed. The leader of the Wagner mercenary group is leaving Russia for Belarus after striking a deal with President Vladimir Putin to end the mutiny. Under the agreement, both Wagner commander and his fighters will be spared prosecution, and the troops have been instructed to return to their bases. Russian Defense Minister has visited Russian troops in Ukraine, his first public appearance since the weekend mutiny by the Wagner Group. Wagner Group rose to prominence after taking an increasingly visible role in the war in Ukraine, including hoisting the Russian flag in the city of Bakhmut after a month-long battle. The crisis appears to have been averted for now, but what happens next for Russia and the Wagner Group remains uncertain.
Mohammad Taimur, who's an expert in Russian affairs, joins us online. Taimur, pleasure to have you on board. Wish you were here in the studios, but nevertheless, it's always a pleasure to have you as part of discussions. Taimur, let's begin without further ado of the Wagner chief, Mr. Prigozhin, who ordered his mercenaries to stop the action as far as their, intrusion into Russian territory is concerned. Do you feel what has happened, this mutinous, adventure that was carried out by the Wagner Group, do you feel this is the biggest challenge that Vladimir Putin has faced in his 22-year rule?
Indeed, it is. Because the actual fact is that ever since President Putin has assumed power, none of his colleagues or anybody from the opposition in the political spectrum of Russia has ever rose to the occasion or put up such a tough resistance or a challenge to the rule of President Vladimir Putin. And he has ruled like an ultimate supreme leader over the Russian Federation for more than 2 decades now. And Mr. Prigozhin was the first person who has actually challenged Mr. Putin the way he did.
All right, Taimur, I also like to understand what was the feud between the Wagner Group and the Russian Federation and the Russian establishment. What happened? Weren't they on the same side?
Well, of course, ever since Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, this animosity between the Wagner forces, which were deployed in early March last year after the initiation of the special military operation, and between the Russian Ministry of Defense and its leadership, most particularly the Minister for Defense, Sergei Shoigu. Mr. Prigozhin used to blame the inefficiency of his troops who were fighting in Ukraine, and he was blaming the Russian Ministry of Defense for not providing his forces with the adequate equipment and resources in order to replenish his forces to have a strong fight against the Ukrainian armed forces. And this was boiling up for the last 10 months when the Wagner forces were engaged in brutal fighting to capture the town of Bakhmut. And every single week, Mr. Prigozhin used to make regular appearances on his Telegram channel to express his apprehensions and his, his complaints against Sergei Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense, but they were falling on deaf ears. So this frustration was building up, and finally it materialized in this armed mutiny as we experienced a few days ago.
Now that an agreement has been reached between the Wagner Group as well as the Russian side, and of course there was a negotiation that involved the Belarusian leader, Mr. Lukashenko as well. What, in your point of view, are the notable features that you feel are important as far as this agreement is concerned?
Well, before I enter into the details of this alleged pact or negotiations between Alexander Lukashenko and Mr. Prigozhin, you have to keep this in mind that although it might seem that Mr. Prigozhin is an expendable, but as far as the Russian foreign policy overtures beyond the borders of Russia are concerned, Mr. Prigozhin is a very vital tool in the hands of the Kremlin that has been used for several years now, effectively, in favor of the Kremlin, I might add. So if anybody is thinking that he is an expendable and can be easily brushed off, I think they are highly mistaken. But now coming back to the details of the alleged negotiations or the pact that was done, the first and foremost important thing that was signed was that the criminal case or the investigation that was opened against Mr. Prigozhin was taken back by the Russian government, and all the fighters of Wagner Group who were involved in moving towards Moscow were also forgiven, and no legal action would be taken against them. The second most important thing is that Mr. Prigozhin would be leaving Russia and would be spending his time in Belarus on exile. And the third one would be that Wagner forces would not be fighting inside Russia, but they would be continuing their operations outside the territory of Russia on the behest of the government of Russia. So I think these three are the main things, or the main elements of the pact that was actually agreed upon by Belarusian President Mr. Alexander Lukashenko and Mr. Prigozhin.
Also, Taimur, I'd like to understand now that there was a certain, we've seen the mutiny that happened. We know that now Prigozhin is on exile in Belarus. But do you feel this is going to dilute the movement that has been assisted by the Wagner Group as far as the Russia-Ukraine conflict is concerned? Or do you feel the momentum continues to be the same?
I think as far as the operational momentum of the Russian armed forces inside of Ukraine is concerned, the operational intensity remains the same. And whatever has happened with Wagner in the past few days, I think majority of the Russian operations inside of Ukraine remain unaffected. Intense fighting has been going on in the eastern and southeast annexed territories of Ukraine, but majorly the operations remain unaffected. But yes, I think over the past several months, President Putin might have felt that Mr. Prigozhin was getting too big for his boots, if I may use this expression, and his power had to be curtailed. So that's why I think sending him on exile while still keeping his forces in the field area is an indication that yes, his power has been drawn down substantially, but he will still remain on the map. Wagner will still remain on the map, although connotations might change and the group might be renamed or even dissolved for that matter, but the troops will remain on ground and Kremlin will continue to use them to its advantage.
All right. Now, in this whole turmoil that ensued following this mutinous overture by the Wagner Group, do you feel Russia's political landscape has changed, will change?
No, I don't think so, but I think it will even work in favor of the Kremlin because as you must be aware that the elections are near, and political point scoring is usually done by everybody who is available on the political landscape. And in Russia, President Putin was already enjoying a lot of goodwill with the people, and after this mutinous fiasco that recently ensued, I think it earned President Putin even more political mileage and sympathy of the Russian public. Although, yes, people might have their own doubts about President Putin having that substantial control over the governance and the country. But I think for the most part, President Putin gets to gain from it, and the political landscape within Russia would majorly remain the same.
Well, apparently the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, begs to differ. He said Russia's weakness is obvious. He says that the longer Moscow keeps its troops, the more chaos it will invite back home. Do you feel this statement holds any value? Do you feel the impact of the mutinous overture by the Wagner Group will have any impact whatsoever on the Ukrainian conflict?
Well, such a statement coming from President Zelensky, I think it's not a surprise. Of course, he would try his best to capitalize on the moment and drive in his narrative furthest as far as possible. But the fact remains that after the capture of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, the Russian armed forces and their reservists slowly and gradually started to replace the Wagner forces that were deployed on the front line. So I believe that yes, some of the operations might get affected, especially in areas where the Wagner forces were easily deployed, such as Bakhmut, Volodar, and Soledar. but they have been gradually replaced by the regular Russian armed forces or the reservists that were constantly being trained ever since the initiation of the special military operation. But yes, Wagner activities outside Ukraine, for instance, in Middle East and in African countries, they might definitely be affected after the reshuffling of their leadership, the way Prigozhin was exiled to Belarus.
But the Ukrainian conflict continues as such, with the Russian involvement as strong as it was in the past. We've talked about Zelensky's reaction. What about the Western reaction and other world leaders who've reacted to this, of course, mutinous overture by the Wagner Group? How do you see the reactions that have emanated? What kind of inference would you like to make from them?
Well, all the reactions from the Western countries or all the countries of the West that are allies of Ukraine, they almost had a similar reaction to the developments of the Wagner mutiny as did President Zelensky. The US, the UK, and all the EU partners, they categorically stated in the early hours of the mutiny that they're closely watching the situation. But after the mutiny has subsided, all the Western allies of Ukraine are now stating that they see some important and some visible chinks in the armor of President Putin's defenses. Their offensive or their invasion of Ukraine might be affected after this mutiny, and his political opponents, President Putin's political opponents, might be strengthened and get emboldened after the acts of Yevgeny Prigozhin against his regime. So yes, the collective West, a term used by Russians, the collective West had a similar reaction to the Wagner mutiny as did President Zelensky.
But of course, the reality is a bit far away from that. That is what you've also said right before you answered this question. As far as the Wagner Group and its prominence is concerned, do you feel that under a new name or under new leadership, this group will continue to gain the same popularity or have the same achievements for Kremlin as it has had in the past?
Well, it would be very naive to say that under a new leadership and under a new name and under a slightly different nomenclature, the group would remain as effective. But it can also be on the advantage of the Wagner Group as well. Maybe the new leadership that will eventually take over of the group might make it even more efficient and make it even more, you can say, better for the interests of the Kremlin. Especially in areas where they're deployed, like I mentioned earlier, in the Middle East and in the African countries where they're actually doing the Kremlin's bidding. So it's anybody's guess that what might happen in the coming future with regards to Wagner's group change of leadership. But I think under a new name, under a new slightly different nomenclature, the Wagner group would continue to operate. And in the area, especially where they are already deployed, because the Kremlin has already invested in this a lot. And let's not forget that Mr. Prigozhin created the Wagner Group at the behest and support of the Kremlin in the first place. So regardless of the name, the group will continue to function, in my humble opinion.
All right, thank you so very much, Mohammed Taimur, to have joined us, to have talked to us about this latest developments in Russia and, of course, this attempt at mutiny by the Wagner Group, which has been laid to rest now. But definitely the White House says the US President Joe Biden has talked with the leaders of France, Germany and the United Kingdom. They say they have affirmed their support for Ukraine. We've told about the statement by Mr. Zelensky. We've also talked about the Russian side. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues to move on in the same pace and doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Let's hope some kind of a process starts that could see the end of this. But anyways, we can only be optimistic as far as that front is concerned. Let's talk of some more optimism from Pakistan's economic front, Pakistan's economic outlook, the government's efforts to stabilize economy, the market that has responded positively to hopes of revival of the IMF 9th EFF facility. Of course, the due date is the 30th of June this year. The shares at the PSX have surged by 1,200 points. The IMF perspective on the ongoing review process also seems to be positive. We've been joined by Mohammed Shaaf, Najeeb, Economist, to talk more about that. Shaaf, pleasure to have you on board and to talk about economy with Pakistan. The KSE 100 surges 1,200 points, Shaaf, during trading. Is this the effect of the measures that have been taken, the budgetary measures that have been taken by the government to stabilize our economy?
Thank you, Omar, for having me at the show again. Well, stock exchange, wherever it is, in whether it is in Pakistan or anywhere else in the world, it's always a volatile affair, and it responds to uncertainty or certainty within the economy. And as you are aware that the budget was presented on the 9th of June, and ever since that there was a debate going on within the parliament, and then that raised the question that whether what kind of the budget would be passed at the end, how many amendments would be made to it, and how would the IMF respond to that. And I think when yesterday on Sunday the budget was finally passed with all the amendments, that gave a very you could say positive message to the markets and particularly to the stock market as well. And the stock market has positively responded to that as well, as we saw today that there have been you could say an increase of 1200 points in the stock exchange. So that is what the certainty that passing of the budget brought in. And of course, today the government has today the state bank, not the government, the state bank has increased the policy rate, the interest rate by 1% again, although their monetary policy committee met a couple of weeks earlier only. So that shows that the government institutions are looking proactively to work based on the changing economic situations, also in close collaboration with the IMF and their demands and their you could say recommendations, so that we are able to you could say we are able to secure the ninth review as well as move forward with the IMF in fulfilling our financing gap for the upcoming budget year as well.
Important. I think the development seems to be positive. It's 1,371 points to be exact as far as the surge in the KSE 100 is concerned. The State Bank of Pakistan, you were talking about that, has announced withdrawal of all restrictions on imports to facilitate the industrial sector. How is the reaction in the markets to this decision?
As Omar in the previous programs also, I have talked to you about that we need to move away from the restriction of imports if we want our economic activity to resume. So that is a welcome step in that. But of course, we have to also look at our reserve situation at this point as well, right? And without the IMF deal, the reserve situation would not be improving in the recent future. So I think it is a welcome step from the State Bank of Pakistan that it has eased up all the restrictions. So there isn't any official ban or official restriction, but for a little time our reserve situation, the dollar reserve, because we have limited amount of dollar reserves as of now, so that will make it slightly difficult for the economic activity to immediately resume on the, you could say, trading part. But I think over the next couple of months, maybe 3 months, over the next quarter particularly, when we hopefully will be able to do the agreement with the IMF, and we hopefully will be able to further get some assistance from our friendly countries as well. I think having taken this step already is going to send a very positive message to the entire market. So over the next quarter, I am looking forward towards, and I am hoping towards, resumption of economic activity because of this change brought by the State Bank of Pakistan.
Year that begins from next month, the government is going to raise 215 billion rupees in new taxes, cut 85 billion rupees in spending, and of course a number of different other measures that it has taken to shrink the fiscal deficit. Are all of these steps compliant with what the demands of the IMF has been?
Certainly, one thing that IMF always focuses a lot on is reducing the deficit, and for that purpose, they propose increasing the revenues. And unfortunately, again, the government, because of its limited fiscal space and its hands tied down, had to turn towards, forcing a little bit more taxes out of the existing taxpayers. So I think one thing that the government must look towards improving within the fiscal year even is how to generate more revenue from, number one, those taxpayers who are not in the tax net, so hence bringing them within the tax net, so that the burden from the existing taxpayers could be reduced, number one. And secondly, also something that we have been mentioned in your programs earlier as well, that we need to look towards realizing the dead capital in the public sector, where the government has a lot of infrastructure and land which is underutilized. The government's housing assets, which value over 1.4 trillion rupees right now, and they're being underutilized. So I think that those are the avenues that the government must look towards tapping into within this year, so that we are able to increase our revenues, facilitate economic activity without hampering or further deteriorating the fiscal deficit. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for us here to, you could say, reform the way we do economics in Pakistan.
The petroleum development levy has been increased. The allocation for the BISP has been increased. And of course, other measures are taken. We talked about the compliance with the IMF program. But how do you see that generally as an economist, these measures that have been taken, how important are these in the short term and in the long term for Pakistan's economic outlook and its stability?
I think in the short run, these measures were unfortunately inevitable because the government needed to raise revenues, right? So it had to take those measures. And hopefully that will lead us to securing the agreement with the IMF, and eventually that will help us in securing some support from our other friendly relations as well. So if these buyers are able to, you could say, turn that wheel for us, where you could say, because of raising these revenues and increasing these taxes, we are able to cover up our financing gap, and that helps us resume our economic activity, especially now that the State Bank of Pakistan, as we just talked about, has removed restrictions on imports as well. So I think in the long run, over the year, this might be able to prove beneficial for us, despite the difficulties that it will bring to the people. Because, of course, if you're increasing the petroleum levy, if you're increasing the tax rates, that is an additional burden on the people. But maybe over the year, if other things fall right into the place, then maybe this is one of those hardships that we might be able to tolerate for the greater good of the country in the coming year. But as I said, the government must also look towards other ways to increase its revenues, so that something that we all know that governments do not want is burdening the existing taxpayers. So hopefully that will ease up that space for the government as well, if it is able to realize other areas where it has potential to raise revenue from.
Shaaf, last week the IMF had shown certain reservations as concerning our budget. Do you feel those reservations have been dealt with, and what were those reservations?
Basically, the IMF always looks towards number one, the deficit that you have, and of course, secondly, how you are going to meet the fiscal deficit you have, number one, and secondly, the trade deficit and how you're going to finance that. So I think hopefully those reservations would now be removed, and I think the trust deficit that in the last recent past that was present there, that would be reduced, and there would be a more, you could say, positive environment in which the Pakistani government representatives and the IMF representatives could reach to an agreement where we could move forward with them, and I hope that these measures are actually going to help for that.
All right. Also, if you remember well, there was a new global financing pact held in France recently, and on the sidelines of that, our Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif met with the IMF head Kristalina Georgieva. How important do you feel that meeting has been also in order to further process the EFF facility and the IMF Pakistan relationship?
Our finance teams have been constantly in touch with the teams of the IMF, obviously. But the meeting of the Prime Minister would have helped, I hope, in presenting our vision of presenting the vision of our government for the coming year and in the long run as well, much better to the IMF head, which could hopefully send a positive signal to the entire IMF team as well, right? So the meeting of Pakistan's Prime Minister on the sideline of that summit in France with the IMF head, I hope that has actually proven helpful in the changes that we made recently in our budget, as well as the change made by the State Bank in the interest rate, as well as other trade-related restrictions that they have removed. So I think these forward-looking changes have actually come as a result of that meeting, and as well all the other meetings that our finance teams from the Ministry of Finance, the State Bank, and the FBR that have been having constantly with the IMF. So these meetings certainly have proven helpful in getting, you could say, the negotiations forward.
All right. Now, speaking of negotiations, you know, the June 30th is the deadline as far as this facility is concerned. Do you feel, are you optimistic? Let me rephrase the question. Are you optimistic about the 9th EFF tranche coming by the 30th of June?
What are we if we are not optimistic, right? If we do not have hope, I don't think we would be able to deal with any of these changes. So yes, I am hopeful that we still have a few days to reach the agreement with this IMF, and that will help us in achieving in getting that tranche. But even if, let's say, worst case scenario, Omar, let's say that we are not able to get that facility within this fiscal year, it's not all lost for Pakistan then, because these negotiations have been going on for quite a while and they have been moving forward recently. So even if we are unable to, you could say, get that 9th review, we could negotiate based on what the talks that have happened, a new program coming in the next fiscal year, and especially with the new elections coming up and a new government coming up and the stability required for that. And I think even if we are not able to secure that, although I am hopeful that we will, but even if worst case scenario we do not have to worry in the sense, because our negotiations have moved quite forward as well. So we might be able to get the new program even in the worst case scenario. And I hope
Inshallah,
that
one should always look at the glass half full and remain optimistic, and I totally agree with you on that. 30th of June isn't far away, and we'll inshallah know in a couple of days where we stand as far as the IMF is concerned and the 9th EFF facility. But of course, this is a relationship that is ongoing and will continue in the coming months and years as well. Thank you so very much, Muhammad Shaaf, Najeeb, Economist, who have talked to us about Pakistan's economic outlook. Let me end with Pulwama. We all remember Pulwama by 2019, but also Indian Army soldiers recently entered a grand mosque in Pulwama. They vandalized it before forcing the muezzin along the worshippers to also chant Jai Shri Ram. Nothing new about that, about the Jai Shri Ram slogans. Many a times within India also, these so-called hooligans of the BJP or the Hindu extremists have been doing that to all kinds of Muslim worshippers or Muslims across the country. Now, this incident has triggered strong anti-protest demonstrations in the area. This incident triggered also massive outrage within the civil society and the political leaders, terming it as a violation of religious freedom. Nothing new there, you know, violation of religious freedom has been going on in India for quite some years, in fact, especially since the BJP government came into force. Now, this happened in the night of Friday 23rd of June and Saturday 24th at around 1:30 am, when the group of soldiers from the Indian Army's 50 Rashtriya Rifles arrived in the village. They were, of course, accompanied by an unidentified officer, as per the reports. Locals said that during the operation, soldiers detained at least 10 teenagers of the villagers, 5 of whom were then beaten up. They also vandalized the Jamia Masjid Zadura, the largest mosque in the South Kashmir village. This also takes place at a time when the Indian Home Minister Amit Shah is visiting the occupied Jammu and Kashmir region. The fact remains that the brutalities by the BJP and the Indian forces within Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir and outside continue unabated, and this needs to be highlighted as much as possible. The world needs to understand that having a strong economic relationship with India is their prerogative, but to also highlight the abuses and put India on a stand when it comes to that, and make it revert all the decisions that it has taken since 5th of August 2019 is also needed in parallel. With that, we come to an end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah ta'ala with another show, more on Pakistan, more on Eid, but of course tomorrow is Hajj, so we'll be highlighting that as well, and then Eid is also upon us. Have a very good evening, and we'll see you soon inshallah. Allah Hafiz.